Thank you, Imran, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I have the privilege of chairing our first panel today of international experts. This panel is going to focus on how bad actors use social media platforms to spread hate and disinformation. This should be a varied discussion. We've got expertise on the panel on everything from Covert Disinformation, polarisation, violent extremism and more. And hopefully this will help us understand some of the online harms we face and begin to illuminate some of the potential solutions that we can discuss throughout the rest of the conference today. So I'm Callum Hood. I'm the Head of Research at the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, leading a global team investigating online hate and misinformation. I'm responsible for many of the Centre's reports, particularly those exposing the activities of the deadly anti-vax industry throughout the pandemic, and lead our work on investigating the economic models that underpin hate and disinformation. Delighted to have with us today Maria Ressa. Maria is the CEO of Rappler.com, an online news organisation in the Philippines. Maria's courage and work on disinformation and fake news culminated in being awarded the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize, recognising her efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Her numerous awards include being named Time's 2018 Person of the Year and listed amongst its 100 most influential people of 2019. So thank you for being here, Maria. We've also got Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who's a professor at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Polarisation and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab in the Centre for University Excellence. Dr. Miller-Idriss has testified before the US Congress and regularly briefs policy, security, education and intelligence agencies in the US, the United Nations and other countries on trends in domestic violence extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. Her most recent book is Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. And finally, we have Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo, who is a professor of epidemiology and inaugural director of the Pandemic Centre at Brown University School of Public Health. She's a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, an epidemiologist by training. Her work focuses on global health security, public health, preparedness and response, and health systems resilience. Together with colleagues from the Nuclear Threat Initiative and Economist Impact, she co-leads the development of the first ever Global Health Security Index. She also directs the Outbreak Observatory, which conducts in partnership with frontline public health practitioners operational research to improve outbreak preparedness and response. Thank you all for being here. And we will kick off with the first question. So when I began at CCDH, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we decided that we had to invest the majority of our time into working on COVID and later vaccine disinformation, because it was a range of actors, not just anti-vaxxers, but also peddlers of hate, were using the opportunity of the pandemic to exploit ordinary people's anxieties about the unknown, about the threat that this posed to them and to their lives. So I'd really like to hear the panel's insights on how bad actors have exploited the environment that developed in the pandemic. If you'd like to start, Dr. Nuzzo, if you'd like to start giving your experience supporting a national response to COVID-19, what you observed.
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much for hosting me here and for putting together this important discussion. I have been working in public health preparedness, pandemic preparedness for 20 years, and the COVID-19 pandemic is really unlike many other events that we have experienced over the years, but crucially this question of information and the role that information has played in terms of keeping people alive and enabling them to live safe and healthy lives, and their inability to do so because of an information environment that's been completely poisoned by lies. I have just not seen anything like this in the past 20 years. It's really stunning. You know, at the beginning of this pandemic, actually, I was recently reminded, somebody asked me, you know, how bad do you think this could get? Do you think it's possible that the United States could lose 1 million people? And at the time, I looked at a very fast-moving virus for which we had, at that point, no medical countermeasures to help protect people, to prevent death. And I said, yes, I think it is possible. Flash forward a year later, we were very fortunate that decades of research into developing vaccines and new vaccine technologies enabled not just one, but several safe and effective vaccines that basically take off the table, for the most part, this virus's ability to kill people. So at that point, I was feeling a lot more optimistic, but I have to tell you, the fact that we have lost more lives since the development of multiple safe and effective vaccines is just an utter human tragedy. I can't put it into any other words. I am sorry to say the United States recently passed the very grim milestone of 1 million deaths. These are 1 million reported deaths. Likely a vast undercount because we know that not everybody who dies of this virus gets counted as such. And to think that the majority of that has happened since the availability of safe and effective vaccines is just nothing short of a human tragedy. So many people have come to me over the past 2 years asking questions, and I can't tell you how many times those questions are rooted in basic lies that they have seen on the internet. These are well-meaning people who are trying to do their research, who are desperate to get facts to protect themselves and their families, but they are doing their research in an information environment that's completely poisoned by lies. So it is impossible for them to find facts. And the scale of this was really driven home to me when I had a question asked to me by a former senior government official, someone who arguably had access to the best information, who has enough understanding of government agencies to be able to distinguish conspiracy from truth, asked me a question that was very much rooted in, at the time, a very common internet conspiracy. That this individual was unable to see the conspiracy for what it is made me realize that most average adults are going to have a hard time sorting out lies from facts. And so it is unfortunate that this is the situation that we're in, where people just don't even have access to the most life-saving tool, which is the information that they need in order to protect themselves. It's just truly staggering, and it's unlike nothing I've seen at any other point in my career.
Yeah. I think one of the tragedies during the pandemic has been that people who are going to the internet to find simple answers to questions, very reasonable questions they have, because we were all in a high degree of ignorance at the beginning of the pandemic about COVID and lots of questions to answer for people on vaccines as well. And the first thing they often come across is disinformation provided by very professional, in many cases, anti-vaxxers or. Yeah. Dr. Idriss Miller, one of the things I noticed during the pandemic, and again one of the things that sort of began our inquiry into COVID and vaccine disinformation, was the way that right-wing extremists were exploiting the issue. And indeed it's been a very interesting period, because this was the same period in which we saw January the 6th happen. How did you see the far right exploit the opportunities of the pandemic?
Well, there were many different ways that the pandemic created opportunities for the far right, for far right extremists. I would say, first of all, it became an opportunity to circulate all kinds of hateful misinformation, dehumanizing information about that was anti-Semitic, that was anti-Asian, right? That carried propaganda about minority groups, about historically marginalized groups as it relates to the vaccine or to the virus itself. So that's one opportunity. They also just exploited the fact that almost everybody was home and online all the time, and so that the sheer amount of time that people were spending online became an opportunity to reach out to people and to exploit the fact that people were anxious and feeling a loss of control, which we know can lead them to be more susceptible to conspiracy theories that offer them a black and white way of looking at the world. And so I would say there were sort of endless strategies and opportunities for them to do that. But part of the problem is it met an information ecosystem where propaganda and disinformation is no longer a destination that people kind of have to seek out, but is just much more likely to come to you wherever you spend time online. And so, people are just on their social media feeds. And the way we describe this is, pretty much everyone is always 2 clicks away from bad information or propaganda or disinformation. If you follow the wrong hyperlinks, or a friend from high school's post shows up in your feed and you click on it, that's sharing a viral video that is espousing misinformation about about the virus, about a vaccine, or about anything else. And so people are struggling, I think, in their free time, not even, that because they're seeking out, sometimes that happens, but not just that they're seeking out, it just shows up where they are in their online gaming chats, in their they're looking up, they're on some social media account looking for gardening tips, and somebody drops in, with misinformation. So we have to have a different level of sort of immunization and inoculation against the disinformation and the propaganda, with the assumption that everybody's going to encounter it, much like a virus.
To what extent do you think it's a case that some bad actors, say far-right extremists, are actually trying to design content which is very permeable into the mainstream, and to what extent is it the fault of just the way that the social media platforms work?
I think it's both, right? I mean, I think part of what's happening is that you have bad actors who are taking advantage of the situation, deliberately creating content that aligns with different platforms, that is designed to go viral, or that they hope will go viral. But we also have, the fact that memes, for example, have no authors, right? No real authors. I mean, they're very organic. They can constantly be changed. You don't just have, and it gives people a sense of power as well to constantly be, to be changing these, and to use humor and irony and satire and carry disinformation in through jokes that then get dismissed as just a joke, right? But carry that propaganda, disinformation, or dehumanizing content about marginalized groups. So I think it's both. That's part of the challenge, is that there's no one strategy that's going to work to fix it all. We have to have a multi-pronged, holistic, whole of society kind of approach at every level, at every age. We need disinformation, kind of media literacy training for kindergartners, and we need it for 80-year-olds, right? I mean, people are susceptible to this across the life course.
Thank you. And Maria, one of the things we've noticed is that, for example, in the case of anti-vax disinformation, it's often exported worldwide. And in fact, many of our studies are focused on US actors, where there's a very professional anti-vax industry. And we've seen it being exported to places like the Philippines, where, for example, Dr. Joseph Mercola has a whole lot of staff working on content for his websites. What have you seen in the Philippines and elsewhere about how this spreads on a global scale?
I think it's the opposite. It's not that you're exporting it to us. You exported the design to us, right? But all of those things, Mercola, your number one on COVID disinfo, he was creating the stuff in the Philippines, right? So we're actually exporting it to you. Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Chris Wiley, he said that colonialism never died, it just moved online. That's the design. Right? And that is, kind of like what Jennifer said, it's both, but frankly, the incentive structure of how we are connected, I'm beginning to hate that word, the incentive structure breaks down facts, breaks down truth, breaks down trust. So how can all of these things that we're talking about not be happening? I've said this repeatedly in the last 6 years, it's without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. So without these, we have no shared reality. We have no rule of law. There's no democracy. That's the part in the big picture. But for each of us, I think before COVID, I even had said this, that, there's a virus of lies. It's infected us. It tracks you down because of the business model of surveillance capitalism. And once you're infected, it's not something that you're like terrorism. Sorry, the two biggest stories of my career were instances where the Philippines was used as a testing ground to attack you, to attack the West, right? This is 9/11. I don't know if you remember this. One of the biggest story before all of this was how the architect of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi Youssef, who did the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. After he did that, he went to the Philippines in 1994, and they tested these tactics of getting through airport security through Manila. So when 9/11 happened, it was actually a memory for me of interrogation reports of the very first pilot who was recruited by Al-Qaeda. He was arrested in the Philippines in 95, and then he was in the Supermax prison. So here we are again in, what year did we, 2016, when we realized that, oh my gosh, there are new tactics, and we can call it extremism, you can call it radicalization, but it changes the way you see the world. And when you change the way you see the world, you change the way you act. And I think this is where, and the last part I'll just say is, it's power and money. Why were the systems created? Power and money, right? By design, they polarize and they radicalize. By design. All of the data and the evidence that we have in the Philippines, the data and the evidence that you have shows this. The data and evidence that Facebook, that YouTube, that Twitter, they show this. And the second thing is COVID, whether it's COVID or measles. You guys remember the measles outbreak before COVID? The Philippines had 3 times the number of measles, and some of the states here, because that was the beginning of anti-vaxxers. They worked on the same networks of disinformation, and then COVID on top of that. It is about power and money. It is the same networks of disinformation, and I really would say disinformation rather than misinformation, because it's not. The virus is disinformation. When it infects real people, I have friends and family who have been infected here. My parents live in Florida. That becomes maybe misinformation, but even then, it's by design again. So, yeah, long answer to your question.
Very good.
But they are all connected, you know, it's thank you for putting us together on the panel. But I guess the last part is, we watch what happens in the Philippines, because it is coming for you. We were the testing ground. Damian Collins, in that very first report, actually was the first one that looked at the entire world, Nigeria, the global south. This is where they test these tactics of mass manipulation. If they work in our countries, Chris Wiley said they port it over to you. So it worked in the Philippines. Our last elections on May 9th, presidential elections, 36 years after Ferdinand Marcos was ousted in a people power revolt, his son and namesake, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., was overwhelmingly elected with vast networks of disinformation, 2-1. He is now he's not yet presumptive. He's presumptive, he's not yet president-elect, but will soon be, given the unofficial results we're seeing. Yeah.
Yeah, we see all the time these techniques that work get picked up by other actors elsewhere in the world, and I'm just going to take you up on mentioning measles. I was saying to Jennifer earlier, one of the great tragedies of the COVID disinformation pan, you know, sort of the pandemic of disinformation during the COVID pandemic was that in 2019 we had the measles outbreaks, and it was one of the things I was sort of looking at when I first began our work on this, that there was a real opportunity and a discussion around how social media platforms had contributed to outbreaks of measles in early 2019, and unfortunately platforms had done a pretty minimal amount to deal with the problem, and it left most of the sort of anti-vax infrastructure in place ready to take advantage of it, the opportunities presented to them by
Layer
COVID
on layer
pandemic.
on layer, right? It's just layering on top of layering on top of layering.
Yeah. So next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how bad actors use online spaces to abuse and silence critics and to sort of degrade democracy. Our very first report in 2019 actually examined the issue of trolling and how it's instrumentalised by some bad actors to control online conversations and push other people out of them. I'm going to complete Maria's. You gave part of this quote just, but how you expressed this beautifully in your Nobel Prize speech. About how platforms had allowed a virus of lies to infect each other, pitting us against each other, bringing out our fears, anger and hate, and setting the stage for the rise of authoritarians and dictators around the world. So Maria, I think you're very well placed to tell us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of how some actors use online spaces to attack journalists, to restrict free speech and democratic norms.
Yeah, sure, and I'll keep it short. So look, it's the same thing whether it's Ukraine. So I know this because I'm in the process of finalizing a book. It's called How to Stand Up to a Dictator. I wrote the first part of it, the prologue, in December, and it started in 2014 with Ukraine, and now, of course, with the invasion, it becomes something different. And then the election of Marcos. So those are the things I'm putting back in. But two methods. So and you see this in the United States. You see it in anywhere. The first is whether it's journalists or anyone on Facebook, because in the Philippines it was really the citizens who were pounded first. You suppress or repress. Online, you just keep pounding until you pound the person to silence, or you pound that narrative to silence. In the Ukraine, if you remember at the annexation in 2014, that narrative was just pounded. The people who had it were pounded to silence. And then that's step one. Step two becomes, after you repress, you replace. You seed the narrative. And when you seed the narrative, it doesn't have to go viral, because I think too much emphasis is placed on virality. Once you seed it, case in point, January 6th, here, the meta-narrative of election fraud was seeded in a year earlier, in August of 2019 on RT. Not a surprise. This is the work of the Election Integrity Partnership that I'm quoting here. Seeded in August 2019, picked up on YouTube by your usual suspects. This is the guy behind Cambridge Analytica, one of the guys behind it. And then Tucker Carlson picks it up closer in October 2020, before then President Trump comes top down. That's the second methodology. I say bottom up and then top down. In Tagalog, we have something called bibingka, where the fire is both on the top and at the bottom, top and bottom, and you're just cooked. So that's kind of the two ways: suppress, repress, replace. And then bottom up, top down. Works in all of us. And what does it do? It just manipulates our biology. For all of it, we're still very thinking slow this entire conference. We think. What if you don't think? What if it's our amygdala, our emotions, that are being used against us? And that's actually part of our problem. Are any of us willing to manipulate the emotions of people who we want to convince? Probably not if you're here. How do we deal with it?
We'll be discussing that later today in the right place. It's very interesting what you said about sort of seeding some of these narratives and how sort of blossoms into something much more dangerous later on. I know my own colleague Marlene did some work on Gateway Pundit, which was one of the most instrumental,
of course,
sort of quote unquote news websites to be pushing a lot of election disinformation, which we know has resulted in threats of attacks on election officials in the US. I was wondering, Cynthia, if you could talk to us a little bit about how you've seen the far right increasingly utilise threats of violence and so on to get what they want.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. There are two things that come to mind. The first thing I'm going to say is about some research that we have coming out of the lab with Kurt Braddock that some of you may have read about what we call subversive online activity, which is basically bad behavior online, including trolling and doxing. And Kurt calls it our silly putty finding because we weren't looking for it. Silly putty apparently was a product that came out of some other research. But it was one of the most interesting things we found is that because we had this in partnership with Jigsaw on our video-based inoculation work, we had to ask a battery of questions to get people into the right study to watch different kinds of videos, and that included self-reported behavior and where they spend time online, and it was embedded in lots of non-bad spaces online, so that they didn't really know exactly what we were asking. But anyway, they've answered this battery of questions. We use that to sort them into studies, but it turns out that the ones who self-reported spending a lot of time trolling or doxing or doing other things that were kind of bad behavior online, subversive online activity, were far more persuaded by far-right propaganda than anybody else in the study. So, that's not an unexpected finding, and we don't know the direction, right? We weren't looking for this finding, so we can't tell you, is it, which one causes the other. But I think it's, I talk a lot, and we talk a lot about where people spend time online in these toxic spaces, but it turns out it also matters how you spend time online, and that in terms of whether or not, information is persuasive or disinformation is persuasive. And so that says a lot about both cross-platform problems, right? It's not just one platform, shutting down one platform or changing one platform isn't going to help, but it also says something about how you intervene with youth in particular about their behavior online in terms of, what in some digital communications classes is called good citizenship or, digital citizenship. But we need to think about how people are engaging with others online and what that kind of digital discourse looks like. Of course, we see a lot of attempts to silence threats. I mean, I bet a lot of us in this room get a lot of those, right? And so there's a lot of diverse ways that happens, not very creative, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of unoriginal, ordinary types of threats that I think are basically the same as have been done previously, but just taking advantage of different ways to reach people and to produce kind of also fake videos. That's fake videos about people, fake information. So, I won't give more oxygen to those strategies at this moment, but just to say that they exist, they have existed for a long time, and I think paying attention to the ways that some of that bad behavior affects the persuasiveness of propaganda is really important.
Something we often see as well is that often in the form of conspiracy theories, the level of sort of rhetorical stakes that are put in place justify all kinds of behaviour. So we've seen it now, and it's one of the things that we think about a lot in terms of conspiracy theories and worry about a lot, is that where they become attached to particular problems with hate or misinformation, they can raise the stakes so high, a sort of life or death or good or evil battle, that any tactics become legitimate. And Jennifer, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, because one of the things that's been very alarming during the COVID pandemic is that the very same doctors and scientists who are supposed to be protecting us have become subjects of threats of violence themselves.
Yeah, it's incredibly common. I mean, I think almost every single one of my colleagues I know has received countless threats over the past 2+ years. Certainly I have. And when I see the impact of these threats, first of all, I think one of the things that I worry about most is I've seen a lot of really expert and reasoned voices leave the social media space because of the proliferation of hate and abuse that the platforms enable. They just simply can't handle or endure the continued abuse. And so when you have an exit from the information environment where people are trying to get their information of the people who have the expertise, that's a real problem. Separately, I have spoken to hundreds of groups and individuals over the past 2 years about COVID and the vaccines, and very frequently when you hear the people who are most in distress trying to figure it all out, you ask them, do you feel like you could talk to your healthcare provider? And they almost always say they don't have one. So they don't have direct access to experts. So they go to the platforms to look for information. And when you have on the platforms an exit of the expert voices because of the abuse that is rampant on the platforms, you're leaving people with searching for information in an environment that's completely stilted away from the facts. You also have a situation where what is discussed on these platforms then influences what is discussed in mainstream media. So the controversies that get picked up on social media then make their way into articles, because journalists are, first of all, looking for stories, but also they have to report on what's going on, and the conversation is what's going on. And so then that proliferates it, so then people see it in multiple places. Then there is a situation where the result of those lies then comes back to the experts, and the experts are just overwhelmed trying to debunk and to counter what's out there. I will tell you, I've seen every single pieces of this. I haven't yet left the platform. Actually, that's not true. I did leave a Facebook platform because I couldn't offer the right information without it then getting hijacked by false narratives. And I honestly felt like trying to engage on that platform to counter what was there was just actually giving more real estate to the lies, which is unfortunate because this was not a big thing. This was actually a community level organization and something you want to help out your community. But I have seen so people come to this platform, they try to get information, they can't. Then if they do, reach out to experts separately, because again, these people are not fringe people. This is everyday adults trying to navigate incredibly complex times and make very difficult decisions on very complex issues. And they see things and they want to understand, is this right, is this correct? So very frequently I'll get emails from people, over the years, lots and lots of emails from people I don't know. And I try to answer as many of them as I can, but it's truthfully kind of overwhelming at times. But often I'll get an article it's not a huge press out, it's usually a small press outlet, but it will say something like, study finds X, which is always something about the vaccine is doing this thing that you don't want to have happen to you. It never links to the study. And people they honestly want to know, why is this article wrong? I can't find the actual study usually, but when I can, the study almost never says what the article reports. And it probably means that whoever wrote the article didn't actually read the study, but they saw what was being discussed online. And so then you have to read the study and then go, point by point, why what is in the article is not correct and why the study very much said something differently. And it's important that we do this, but this is incredibly exhausting, laborious work. Most people don't have time to do this. If people had a healthcare practitioner, most healthcare practitioners don't have a time to sit and have those study by study, article by article debunking conversations. So it's just a really unfortunate situation where people are getting just inundated with the wrong voices, and there is now, unfortunately, an increasing deficit of the right voices.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that. It's a very deliberate strategy to exhaust practitioners like yourself, And
not everybody has the protection. When I started getting the first wave of abuse, which started actually from a television personality who I won't give credit naming here, but then spilled over online, and really it's from the online platforms where the abuse comes. I mean, my university, I was at Johns Hopkins at the time, had to invest in security, and that was not uncommon. Not all experts have access to that level of resources to protect them. And so I completely understand why they feel like it's safer for me and my family to exit, to drop out of the conversation and keep working on the things that I work on instead of getting involved in this, because all it courts for them is abuse. Yeah.
Yeah, and I recall in our anti-vax playbook report where we tried to go and look right at the outset of the rollout of vaccines, how anti-vaxxers were planning to exploit that. And we saw some evidence in groups and indeed some leading figures who were deliberately instructing people to go and sort of bombard people like yourself with comments and abuse. And we now know from the Facebook papers as well that they know that the comment sections you talked about for posting on Facebook and just didn't seem worth it in the end, really. The comment sections on Facebook and Instagram were a location where a lot of misinformation was being spread, and as far as we know, not much was being done about it. Yeah. So we're going to just move on now to talk about one of the ways that we try to think about our research at CCH quite often is the user pathways by which people come into contact with hate and misinformation, and how these platforms look from the perspective of an ordinary user. And we know that many of the actors we study have become incredibly adept at using social media to radicalise and recruit supporters. One of the things you wrote about in that same anti-vax playbook report is about how they are really good at creating spaces where people can go and get those anxieties and questions they have about vaccines or about COVID answered, and then try and capture them to become sort of fully signed up activists. Cynthia, if I could start with you. I mean, I was reading just the other week about you sort of writing about mainstream extremism, and we discussed it a little bit earlier in the panel as well, about how people now can just easily encounter really extreme content right there on social media platforms without even seeking it out. And we seem to have had another example of this in just the last week with the Buffalo shooting. So I was wondering how you think about the model that bad actors use to try and create an environment in which extremism can thrive and events like this can happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last week, unfortunately, is a tragic and textbook case of this, if we can believe the reports that terrorist actor described himself of his own radicalization trajectory, which is that he was bored, at the start of the pandemic, started spending on time in sort of dark spaces and encountered disinformation, dehumanizing propaganda that then opened up rabbit holes of other disinformation. And I don't like to use the phrase fell down a rabbit hole because people are still making active choices to click on things, but when it's fed up to you, through recommendation systems that prioritize more salacious content, more violent content, that gets clicks because it is spreading faster, right? It is easier to kind of travel down that pathway. And so again, we tend to think of it as everyone's going to encounter it, right? It's not, there's no destination anymore. There are destinations, of course, but it's not that you have to seek it out. You don't have to sign up for a newsletter or have some initiation rites in a group, right? You just, wherever you are. And I think the fact that so much health misinformation came in through, and including QAnon type conspiracy theories paired up with like wellness communities and people who were maybe a little bit skeptical of alternative medicine, of traditional medicine and promoting alternative medicine, and that there's this marriage of the yoga community and the wellness community and alternative medicine community, anti-vaxxers with then anti-government extremists and conspiracy theories. You start to see this kind of bubbling over and bleeding of disinformation and coalition building almost in odd ways, which also you saw on January 6th, is what we sometimes call the lowest common denominator that united people. The groups that would never ordinarily share any objectives came together in one common denominator, which was disinformation about an election, a supposedly stolen election. So we see how disinformation itself can unite people across disparate groups that would normally not collaborate or cooperate, but can come together in that one instance and even then mobilize to spontaneous violence. And so I think there's, and that a lot of that happens initially on social media, even though we have to look at the offline harms that result, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we think a lot about what we call convergence, which is how all these different harmful misinformation, hate and conspiracy theories come together, often facilitated by conspiracy theories. I was really interested studying QAnon, how sometimes it seemed like a naked business decision on the behalf of some alternative wellness or sort of yoga, alternative health communities to just slap QAnon on their content because it gave them access to this entire new audience of potential.
Yeah, the hashtag kind of carrying through, right? Connecting through, through pairing just throwing a hashtag onto some content that then connects it to lots of others that way. I think it's one of those strategies.
Yeah. Often seem pretty naked, yeah. Marie, I wonder how you've seen bad actors build these ecosystems and bring people into pathways that lead to more dangerous and extreme behaviour.
So a lot of the things that have come out in recent years from what you just said about comments, the 10,000 plus documents, the internal documents of Facebook that were pushed out by Frances Haugen, all of these things, we knew most of it as early as 2016. From the Ukraine, as the folks from the Ukraine started talking to Facebook in 2014 when they saw the things that were happening, right? And it is now 2022, and we still haven't, nothing significant has been done against any of it. What is it? So astroturfing, this is in the comment section. When you hear the social media guys talk about it, they don't talk about the comments, they talk about the posts. The data is misleading that we are fed with. And I guess, so let me lay out some of the things, right? Abuse, online abuse, right? What is the end goal of that? It's both a curse and a blessing that I was a target. And when you're a target, you see things that no one else sees. And when you do that and you're also trying to collect data and get research, it's very useful in that sense, but who wants to really deal with it? So starting in 2016, I was getting 90 hate messages per hour. And then finally by, I think, 2021, so Rappler our research group went through it. That's when we saw the networks that were doing it, connected to the Duterte, Marcos ecosystems. UNESCO last year did a big data case study, and they showed about 500,000 attack accounts against me of the data set that we had. 60% of the attacks were meant to tear down my credibility. Because when you take down somebody, then that's repressed, then you can fill it, right? So 60% meant to tear down credibility. This is my 36th year as a journalist. I've been around a while in Southeast Asia. Thank God it didn't really work, but it did for a fraction of our society. But the other 40% were very specific. It's meant to tear down my spirit. And this is true. And it's not just journalists, But women politicians, for example, have more women academics. Women are more vulnerable to misogynistic attacks. And the platforms actually incentivize this. Because the minute you put in disinformation, inevitably, this is connected to it, gendered disinformation. So 40% meant to tear down your spirit. What else happens? In the United States or in the West, you tend to think of domestic and international. They're all the same. It is directly linked to geopolitical power play. And just like in 2001 for the 9/11 attacks, back then it was Al-Qaeda that hijacked homegrown groups, armed groups in each of these countries into a global jihad. Same thing today. Now it's disinformation. And I started Anne Applebaum first called it Autocracy Inc. I like it better at Autocrats Inc. But there you put Putin, you put Russia, China. Now China went from the great state kind of, great hall, 450 million propaganda statements that were kind of easy to sidestep to the same playbook as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, you name the Autocrats Inc. And in the Philippines, we saw our Marcos, Duterte disinformation networks directly linked after the 1,000-page report at the US Senate in December of 2018. We found the link to the IRA and the GRU. And then Facebook itself said in Feb 2020 that they took down information operations from China that were changing the image of the Marcoses, because it was getting ready for elections, already campaigning for Sara Duterte, the daughter of Duterte. And it wasn't just working on us, this network from China, it was also creating fake accounts using AI-generated photos for the US elections in November 2020. This is multi-purpose. It is toxic. It encourages the worst of humanity. But like we have said, online violence is real-world violence. It affects all of us. And it's, the last thing I'll say is, it's like, I don't know if you're my generation, you know the cartoons where you have a devil and the angel on your shoulder and you have to make a really tough choice. And, the devil will tell you, go for it, even do a bad thing. Then the angel's trying to tell you to have a conscience. Well, with our information ecosystem, with these social media platforms delivering and connecting us, I hate that word again, the angel's been kicked off. The devil has like a direct IV into your brain or your veins. And this is why the world is the way it is. But we can't give up, right? And yes, security. So what happened? So many attacks, and it wasn't just me. I'm old compared to our reporters. The median age of our reporters in Rappler is 23 years old. And the woman who was targeted by Duterte, our reporter covering her at that point, was 25 years old. So we increased security. There was a point in 2018 I had to have closed-in security, bulletproof vests, because we have traffic in the streets before COVID. Now we're back again, and the way they target you is by motorcycles coming in, shooting you, and then driving off. It's real. These threats are real. So I don't know why we don't stop the online toxic sludge.
Yeah, we just published a report not long ago called Hidden Hate, which was looking at the misogynist abuse, including death threats and violent threats that get sent directly into people's DMs, which is a sort of unfiltered sewer pipe of abuse. And it's obviously very psychologically affecting because it's coming straight to you. And it often, as you've described, can result in real world.
And it normalizes it, right?
Yeah.
You're constantly on the trigger of anger and hate. And that's not where we accomplish things.
Yeah. And Jen, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you've seen ordinary users sort of encounter disinformation about COVID or vaccines or other health misinformation, and then sort of be taken in further and further by it.
Yeah, I deeply worry about the moment that we're in right now and the level, how far the disinformation has permeated in terms of our response to COVID, but then is spilling over more broadly. So, it was not just with the vaccines, we saw it leading up to it. In that first year, all people could use to protect themselves was information. There was nothing else. And yet we saw countless lies directed at everything. The most crazy thing that I saw was there was a COVID testing center in rural America that was graffitied with PCR tests fake. And that was a rising narrative online, questioning the veracity of our gold standard test for COVID infections. That, of course, then spilled over into the vaccine, and I really credit CCDH with their report, your early report in the fall of 2020, just before the availability of these vaccines, showing how the anti-vax community was really coordinated and organizing to sow doubts about the vaccines, not just the COVID vaccines, but just seeing that as a pathway to sowing doubts about vaccines in general. That was a stunning and terrifying report for me, because I knew that on the medical and public health side, we were not similarly organized. We had no playbook for rolling out those vaccines and talking about the benefits. It was a completely new technology being used. Of course, it had decades of research behind it, but that wasn't something that was widely understood. So we, were caught sort of flat-footed in that moment, and they gained tremendous amount of ground. And I'm sorry to say that now those other ambitions are starting to come true, where we are seeing now a drop-off in childhood immunizations. We are seeing states rolling back legal requirements for school-based vaccines because of these false narratives that have emerged about COVID vaccines. We're seeing school districts struggling, trying to figure out what to do about COVID vaccines that are allowing parents what I consider to be a reasonable option to opt out of mandatory vaccination of your children, but adding it to a list of other vaccines. And now people are sort of wondering, well, do I really need that? Do I really need that? Do I understand the motives of the people who are making these other vaccines? All of the same questions that they were raising about COVID, I see spilling over. I see it spilling over into questioning, basic public health authorities that were frankly, put into place to protect us in some of the most extreme circumstances. I got into this field shortly after September 11th, and I saw at the time when I started in public health a very sort of antiquated field that saw its vulnerabilities when we were countered with the possibility of the United States and others countries being attacked. And realizing the importance of modernizing public health authorities so that, God forbid, we ever were faced with a deliberate epidemic, we could act swiftly. And now I'm seeing a rollback in those protections. There was a lot of talk about trust, and there were certain missteps, of course, in any response to any sort of crisis, for sure. And people were scared, and people were seeking information. And I really fear that actors have sort of put themselves in the lives of people and made them, further question what had been previously unquestioned organizations and government responses. And I fear that we have sort of a generational effect that we're going to have to combat here. It's really going to have far, far-reaching consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned in earlier questions, there was a thriving anti-vax, strong anti-vax movement going into the pandemic. Organisations like Corona have had some impact on the anti-vax industry, but in many ways it's more popular an idea than ever.
It was a rising problem that the public health and medical communities were worrying about, and we were getting increasingly worried. And you had referenced the measles outbreaks that happened just before COVID, the pandemic, and that was something that we saw and worried about. And I think there were signs in the measles that it was getting worse. It is far worse than it was then now, and it will continue to be worse. There's also this other aspect of, as I mentioned before, with kind of the expert voices departing, people are also seeing an opportunity to use the platforms for their own personal gain. And you mentioned, people trying to sell alternative remedies and things like that, but people are also realizing that it's also a way to get famous. And the way to get famous is to be outrageous.
Yeah.
And that now has incentivized an engagement online that favors outrage. And it's not just COVID, we have, these tragic hepatitis situation with children across the world that as a mother, I can't think of anything more terrifying than the thought of having something like that happen to your child. And people are seeing that as a moment to get out there and make all sorts of outrageous claims, claiming that the children died because they were vaccinated, even though they were too young to be vaccinated. So it's just, there's going to be far, far-reaching consequences that it's going to spill over well beyond COVID when we're no longer talking about it.
You've brought me very neatly onto my next question. So, a lot of our research looks at how bad actors profit from hate or disinformation in some way. And I remember right at the start of the pandemic first report I wrote at CCDH was about David Icke, who's a conspiracy theorist, for those unfamiliar with him. At the time I thought he was slightly unusual. He built a family business around disinformation and around conspiracy theories. And had applied it very quickly to COVID. And at that time, his content was very, very popular, COVID disinformation. But, of course, we know that this is a very common business model. So I wonder if I could start with you, Cynthia. I mean, there's lots of little cottage industries connected with sort of far-right extremism.
Yeah, I mean, I studied merchandise for a long time on the, T-shirts, basically. I wrote a whole book about T-shirts, and which you'd be surprised you can write a whole book about T-shirts and far-right propaganda, both because the phenomenon of the mainstreaming of the aesthetics of far-right youth culture that started in Germany really allowed a lot of coded hate to be embedded in clothing that was then not recognizable to teachers and to other adults in settings where there were bans on swastikas or other hateful content, for example. But also it did generate quite a profit for a lot of those companies and still does. And so one of the things we saw even with the trucker convoy in the US following the Canadian one was that some of the calls to action or propaganda, both about the trucker convoy and about COVID and the vaccine, were actually created by groups who were or individuals who were just trying to sell merchandise by embedding links into some call to action to sell like bumper stickers and T-shirts and convoy-related material at a profit. Had nothing to do with their own ideology, but they're just turning a profit off of it. So I think there's two different things. There are far-right groups, for example, that can actually use this the same way they've used concerts and music concerts over the years or music sales to generate profit. But there's also profiteers who exploit disinformation and propaganda to make profit because they don't care. They don't care about the harms that come out of it. And I think both things are there, and they may have to be addressed slightly differently, but they have the same outcome.
It's stunning how often I'm looking at some social media account as a link in bio, usually to a Linktree account, and there's some sort of T-shirt for sale.
Absolutely. Right.
Maria, we were talking a little bit earlier today about some of the networks that actors in the Philippines have built. How do they seek to sort of make this a profitable rather than a costly exercise? So
the Philippines is almost the other way. So power and money. So money, right? Like I know in the U.S. you guys first talked about these Macedonia. In terms of politics, it was these accounts that were created in Macedonia. We're the opposite. The opposite in terms of it was the scaling up to our 2016 elections. It was politics that drove it, very clearly so, stated that way. Duterte was a candidate from the South who didn't have that much money, and he embraced social media. That was also around when Katie Harbath of Facebook also went to our 2016 elections. And I interviewed her on camera at that point. So it was politics. But then the framework of everything that is done on social media comes from the US. So the original way to actually tackle it, to try to look for solutions, is profit, right? So we did. We then found like a network that was making money, and we did a 3-part series on it, and it took Facebook 13 months to take it down because we're outside. So coordinated inauthentic behavior, we saw very early on it was coordinated authentic harm, that these are real people shoe leather reporting will tell you this is corruption. They're paid. Some are not paid. Some are real people who were infected by the virus. And then it just spreads, right? When it spreads, the things that would have been effective as an action, as an antidote in 2016, are no longer effective in 2022. The weaker we get, the more people believe, who can't find the facts, who can't find the information, the harder it is to come back from the brink. And I think that is the challenge we face. You know, how do you get it back to a place where checks and balances actually work? Where, you know, remember the old world of naming and shaming? That doesn't work in the age of influencers, right? Our experts don't stand a chance. Journalists don't stand a chance, especially when the incentive structure, if you want to survive as a journalist, is to go to anger, hate, because that gets the widest distribution. If you're a real journalist, you're not going to do that. So that means you're not going to get the distribution. So the journalism that will get the widest distribution is the crap. Sorry, not to, it won't strengthen democracy. It won't give you the information that you need, but it will create moral outrage, which will then create mob rule. Virtual, physical, it's the same. Sorry, I feel like I've been talking about it for 6 years, you know. Please do something. Gotta solve. It gets worse. Every day we don't solve it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something really common in a lot of the work that we do. You know, a lot of hate actors or you know, actors involved in political misinformation, disinformation, they'll throw up a website, they'll put ads on it, and they'll write some incendiary headlines. And it in fact even infects sometimes publications that should know better as well. But it's the incentive structure, like you say, that has been built by the platforms. Jennifer, I wonder if I could ask you about, you know, there's a lot of the work that I've done on anti-vax. You know, you run up against the alternative health industry very, very quickly. I wonder what you thought the connection is between some of these actors online who have little alternative health empires and anti-vax disinformation, and how important that alternative health industry is.
Yeah, I mean, it seems clear that people who are raising questions about the vaccines in an attempt to dissuade people are pointing them away from the vaccines to unproven treatments or therapies. And that they seem to also gain profit from. And this is particularly terrible because we have seen throughout this pandemic, you know, the rise of, you know, a succession of unproven therapies being used, not, you know, in conjunction with proven therapies, you know, as an add-on, but as a dangerous replacement for what the ultimate life-saving tool is. And that has had severe consequences. I remember around the time there was some, you know, active policy discussions about whether we would need an additional dose of vaccine, sort of driving in my state of Maryland and seeing a billboard that somebody had erected on their property that said, ivermectin, you know, no booster required. Now, ivermectin at that point had been well disproved. You know, it was not something that credible medical authorities were recommending. There was, you know, many reasons to fear its use because of potential harms caused directly, in addition to not actually helping somebody recover from COVID. And so that has, you know, proliferated. Now, it's been really interesting to watch because I think for people in the medical and public health community, it's puzzling. Like, why would somebody be not willing to take a vaccine, which has gone through regulatory oversight, it's been very well studied, you know, billions of people have taken it at this point, in favor of something else that is also, you know, that is not at all vetted in the same way, you know, that is far more experimental, far less, you know, credible in terms of its impact. And, you know, it seems to be that the difference is when you're actually sick, you know, you've missed your opportunity to prevent your infection. You know, you're looking for literally at that point, you know, sort of the last ditch solutions, unfortunately. I mentioned before that when I've talked to people, have been very hesitant about the vaccine, and I do not blame their hesitancy. I have to say we have to have expected that hesitancy because, again, these were new in a situation that was incredibly new. So people were, of course, going to have very reasonable questions that they needed to have answers. Unfortunately, they sought answers to their questions in an information environment that was poisoned and got the wrong answers to their questions. But when you talk to them, you find out that one of the reasons why is because they don't have healthcare providers in their lives. So there are some people who eschew traditional medicines in part because they can afford to. They're interested in healthier living and other things like that, and they think that a healthy diet and organic foods and other things may help them. But then there's a whole class of people for whom medicine has not been accessible. And they seek an alternative simply because they can't access, they have a hard time accessing the traditional. And so, that is really where I see the danger being seated in reaching people who are in desperate circumstances and capitalizing on those desperate circumstances and saying, don't believe those people, they're making money off of it, you don't have the money, really kind of taking advantage of that sort of, those social disparities and ultimately draining them of their resources and not saving them.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can often see and understand, especially when you can see occasionally on social media, get this glimpse between an interaction of two ways between a user and, say, an anti-vax account or whatever. And you can understand how it might be persuasive to someone who's had a bad experience of medicine or doesn't have access to medicine. Someone comes with a very easy answer like ivermectin. And it seems like the answer to your prayers. We're running out of time, but if I could just very quickly ask each of you to spend just a minute or so saying what you're most worried about going forward, what you think the next trend. So I'm going to bring us to the depths of despair before later today we look at solutions and cheer ourselves up. But start with you, Cynthia.
I mean, I was asked the same question yesterday, so I'm going to give the same answer I gave on national television, which is that my biggest fear right now is that we, on the violent extremism side, we continue to see that this primarily as a law enforcement problem, and we continue to see prevention primarily as a success that's measured by how well we're trained to barricade the doors, instead of investing in really early prevention, media literacy, digital literacy, and all the other things that we know can work to prevent people from being persuaded by propaganda and disinformation in the first place. So that's my 1 minute answer.
Very good. Jennifer?
I am most worried about the fact that from the medical and public health standpoint, we are fighting basically an asymmetric war. That there is an information warfare happening that the medical and public health community is absolutely ill-equipped to handle. We don't even understand technology, much less how to use it and how to combat it. But what we are seeing, the consequences of that lack of preparedness and the lack of defense on that front is a spillover where questions about COVID and COVID control measures and COVID vaccines is really spilling over into multiple areas where we have made hard-fought gains in public health, childhood vaccinations, for instance, public health authorities to combat a swiftly moving contagious infection. And that we are seeing as a result of this basically a weakening of our systems and a movement towards sort of retrograde health, where we are going backwards in time. And I am deeply worried because we just don't have the resources to combat those trends.
Thanks. And Maria?
There are more than 30 elections around the world this year, right? You can't have integrity of elections if you don't have integrity of facts. We don't have integrity of facts. You can't have, so the debate in the Philippines now after the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., our new president-to-be, is people saying, news media saying, maybe we didn't listen enough. It was more liberal guilt. Did we not listen? And every time I hear that, I go crazy because it's not about whether you listen. It's about whether even if you did 100 stories on what the Marcos supporter feels, sorry, I'm not going, even if you did those stories, it's just not going to get to people. And what matters now is really getting to the black box of the algorithmic amplification that decides what you get on your cell phone. And the second part is, please, we got to fix this new very harmful economic model that is putting all of us at risk today. Shoshana Zuboff calls it surveillance capitalism. Who owns our data? These are all connected. Antitrust, content moderation is the least of our problems. If you go up, we're looking at content because that's what we're used to, but it's like we got to eject that. It's the old world. User safety, so many things. Last thing I'll say on this is that we can't give up, until the legislation comes out. I'm looking for solutions this afternoon until we get that, and please get it out sooner rather than later, because poor us on the front lines, right? And poor people who are getting insidiously manipulated every hour, every day. Until we get that out, don't ask me my worst fear. We're not going to survive. The world as we know it, the checks and balances of any functioning democracy, the ability to choose the right solution for healthcare, these things are not going to survive this atom bomb in our information ecosystem. All right, I will shut up now.
Thanks, Maria. So that's the end of our panel. Thank you very much to our panelists. It's been a really useful discussion to try and set the scene with some of the problems that we're going to look at in more detail today and discuss solutions.